The morning mist clung to the grounds of Raymill House like a ghostly shroud, and Thomas Hartwell pulled his collar higher as he approached the imposing iron gates. At 35, Thomas had served as a member of the Royal Protection Detail for over a decade, but today felt different. Today he wasn't protecting anyone. He was investigating a mystery that had kept him awake for weeks. The call had come 3 months after Queen Elizabeth II passing, when the royal household was still sorting through the countless properties and possessions left behind. Camilla, now Queen Consort, had mentioned in passing during a security briefing that some items seemed to be missing from the official inventories. Nothing dramatic, she had said, just small discrepancies that nagged at her organizational mind. But Thomas had noticed the way her voice had trembled slightly when she mentioned it, and the way her eyes had avoided direct contact. As the heavy gates swung open with a metallic groan, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had volunteered for this assignment, driven by a loyalty that went beyond duty. The late queen had been more than a monarch to him. She had been a constant, reassuring presence during the most challenging moments of his career. When terrorists had threatened the palace in 2019, she had personally thanked him for his service, her eyes conveying a warmth that had sustained him through many difficult nights. The gravel path crunched beneath his feet as he made his way toward the main house. Raymill House had been one of the Queen's private retreats, a place where she could escape the formality of palace life and simply be herself. Thomas had been here before, of course, during official visits, but never alone like this. The silence was almost overwhelming, broken only by the distant call of crows and the whisper of wind through the ancient oak trees that dotted the landscape. Mrs. Eleanor Pembridge, the estate's longtime housekeeper, met him at the front door. At 72, she moved with the careful dignity of someone who had spent her entire adult life in service to the crown. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her black dress was pristine despite the early hour. Thomas had worked with her before and knew her to be both discreet and fiercely protective of the royal family's privacy. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying the faint trace of a Yorkshire accent that 60 years in royal service hadn't quite erased. "I must say, I'm relieved someone is finally taking this seriously. There have been irregularities." Thomas nodded, pulling out a small notebook. "Tell me about these irregularities, Mrs. Pembridge." "Start from the beginning." She led him into the main sitting room, where morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across Persian rugs and antique furniture. The room still held the faint scent of the Queen's favorite lavender sachets, and Thomas found himself momentarily overwhelmed by the sense of her presence. "It began about a month after the funeral," Mrs. Pembridge explained, settling into a chair with practiced grace. "I was conducting my usual inventory, something I do quarterly, as you know. The Queen was very particular about knowing exactly what was where. That's when I noticed the first missing piece, which was a small Fabergé, one of her personal favorites. Not particularly valuable by royal standards, but she kept it on her writing desk and touched it often when she was thinking. I assumed it had been moved to another property for safekeeping, but when I checked with the other estate managers, none of them had record of it." Thomas made careful notes, his trained mind already beginning to piece together patterns. "What else?" Mrs. Pembridge's expression grew more troubled. "A photograph in a silver frame, a personal one of her with Prince Philip from their early years of marriage. Several books from her private collection, including a first edition of Jane Austen that she particularly treasured. And, most concerning of all, her private jewelry box. Not the official crown jewels, you understand, but her personal pieces. Things that had sentimental rather than monetary value." The significance wasn't lost on Thomas. Thieves typically went for obviously valuable items, artwork, antiques, anything that could be quickly sold. But someone who targeted personal mementos, photographs, and items with emotional significance was either deeply familiar with the Queen's habits or motivated by something other than financial gain. "Have there been any new staff members recently? Anyone with access who might not have been properly vetted?" Mrs. Pembridge shook her head firmly. "The core staff has been here for years, some for decades. We did have a new gardener start in September, but he's been thoroughly investigated by your people. Clean as a whistle, as they say." Thomas stood and walked to the large windows overlooking the gardens. The grounds were immaculate, as always, but something felt different. There was an energy in the air, a sense of secrets waiting to be uncovered. "Mrs. Pembridge, I need you to show me exactly where each missing item was last seen. Every detail, no matter how small." For the next 3 hours, they walked through the house room by room. Mrs. Pembridge had an encyclopedic knowledge of every piece, every placement, every routine the Queen had followed during her stays here. In the library, she showed Thomas the exact spot where the Austen novel had sat, between a biography of Churchill and a collection of poetry that had belonged to the Queen Mother. In the private sitting room, she pointed to the writing desk where the Faberge egg had pride of place, always positioned at a precise angle that caught the morning light. But it was in the Queen's private bedroom that Thomas felt the first real chill of understanding. The jewelry box had sat on an antique dressing table that faced a large mirror. Mrs. Pembridge explained that the Queen had a ritual of sitting there each morning, selecting her jewelry for the day while reviewing her schedule. The box itself was unremarkable, a simple wooden affair with a faded silk lining. But it had contained pieces that told the story of a long and remarkable life. There was a brooch that Prince Philip had given her for their first wedding anniversary, Mrs. Pembridge said, her voice soft with memory. Nothing elaborate, just a small silver piece shaped like a thistle. She wore it to every significant Scottish ceremony. And her watch, not the official one, but a simple timepiece her father had given her when she turned 18. She kept it wound and set it precisely every morning, even though she hadn't worn it in years. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. These weren't random thefts. Someone was systematically removing pieces of the Queen's personal history, items that captured the essence of who she was beyond her royal role. But why? And, more importantly, who had the access and knowledge to carry out such a precise operation? As they continued through the house, Mrs. Pembridge shared more details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The thefts had been carried out with surgical precision. Nothing had been damaged or disturbed unnecessarily. Expensive items that would have been easy targets, crystal vases, silver candlesticks, valuable paintings, had been left untouched. Whoever was responsible knew exactly what they were looking for and had the skills to take it without leaving obvious evidence behind. Mrs. Pembridge, Thomas said as they concluded their tour in the main hallway, I need you to think carefully. Has anyone shown unusual interest in the Queen's personal habits or belongings? Anyone asking questions that seemed innocent at the time, but might seem suspicious in hindsight? The elderly housekeeper was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on a portrait of the Queen that hung near the staircase. Finally, she spoke. There was something, about 6 weeks ago. A young woman came to the door, said she was a researcher working on a book about the Queen's private life. She had proper credentials, seemed legitimate. She asked if she could interview some of the staff about Her Majesty's daily routines, her personal preferences. I turned her away. Of course, we never discuss such matters with outsiders. But she seemed to know an awful lot already. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Did you get her name? Any contact information? She left a card, though I suspected it was false even at the time. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, she called herself, said she was affiliated with Cambridge University. I kept the card, just in case. Mrs. Pembridge retrieved the business card from a drawer in the front hall desk. Thomas examined it carefully. The paper quality was good, the printing professional, but something about it felt off. The university logo was slightly different from the official version he remembered, and the phone number had too many digits. I'll have our people check this out, he said, pocketing the card. In the meantime, I want you to be extra vigilant. If anyone else comes around asking questions, or if you notice anything else unusual, contact me immediately. As Thomas prepared to leave, Mrs. Pembridge walked him to the door. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the entrance hall. Mr. Hartwell, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There's something else. Something I haven't told anyone because I wasn't sure if it was important. Thomas stopped, his hand on the door handle. What is it? The night before I discovered the first missing item, I heard sounds from upstairs. I thought perhaps one of the other staff members had come in to check on something. But when I investigated the next morning, everyone denied being here. I convinced myself I had imagined it. But now, what kind of sounds? Footsteps. Very soft, very careful. And what sounded like drawers opening and closing. It lasted about an hour. Then, nothing. I almost called security that night, but I talked myself out of it. I wish I hadn't. Thomas felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to align in his mind. Someone had been in the house that night. Someone who knew the layout well enough to move through it in darkness. Someone skilled enough to avoid detection by the sophisticated security systems that protected all royal properties. Mrs. Pembridge, I want you to stay somewhere else tonight. Do you have family you can visit? Her eyes widened slightly. Do you think there's danger? I think someone has been watching this place very carefully, and I don't want you here alone until we know more. Can you arrange to stay elsewhere? She nodded slowly. My sister lives in the village. I can stay with her. Good. Pack what you need and leave within the hour. I'll arrange for additional security patrols tonight. As Thomas drove away from Raymill House, his mind raced with possibilities. The systematic nature of the thefts suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the Queen's personal habits. The focus on sentimental rather than monetary value pointed to motivations beyond simple greed. And the mysterious researcher who had appeared asking pointed questions about the Queen's private life was too convenient to be coincidental. He pulled over at a service station and called his supervisor, Inspector David Morrison, a veteran of royal protection who had worked closely with the Queen for over 20 years. Morrison listened without interruption as Thomas laid out what he had discovered. This is bigger than random theft, Morrison said when Thomas finished. Someone is building a collection of the Queen's personal effects, and they're being very systematic about it. The question is why? Could it be someone trying to create some kind of shrine? An obsessed fan who wants to feel closer to her memory? Possible, but the sophistication suggests otherwise. This feels more organized, more purposeful. I want you to coordinate with MI5 on this. If someone is targeting royal properties with this level of precision, there could be security implications we haven't considered. Thomas agreed and ended the call, but as he sat in his car watching traffic flow past on the motorway, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were dealing with something even more complex than they realized. The missing items weren't just stolen property. They were pieces of a life, fragments of history that someone was collecting for reasons that remained frustratingly unclear. The drive back to London gave him time to think, and by the time he reached his flat in South Kensington, Thomas had developed a working theory. The thefts were too precise, too knowledgeable, to be the work of an outsider. Someone with legitimate access to royal properties was involved, someone who understood security protocols and could move through these spaces without raising immediate suspicion. That night, as he reviewed his notes and began preparing reports for both his superiors and MI5, Thomas found himself thinking about the Queen's final years. She had been increasingly private, spending more time at her personal retreats like Raymill House, away from the public eye that had followed her for 7 decades. During those quiet moments, surrounded by her personal treasures and private memories, she had been most herself. And now someone was stealing those moments, piece by piece. The irony wasn't lost on him. Elizabeth II had spent her entire adult life in service to the public, her every move scrutinized and recorded. But her most private possessions, the things that revealed the woman behind the crown, were now disappearing into the shadows. Whoever was taking them wasn't just stealing objects. They were stealing the last traces of her humanity, the small, personal things that had anchored her to the life she had lived when no cameras were watching. Thomas closed his notebook and stared out his window at the London skyline. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of tracking down the mysterious Dr. Sarah Mitchell and investigating the security logs from Raymill House. He would coordinate with other royal protection officers to see if similar thefts had been reported at other properties. And he would work with MI5 to determine if this was part of a larger pattern that threatened the security of the royal family. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment to mourn, not just for the missing treasures, but for the violation of memory they represented. The Queen had been dead for only months, but someone was already picking apart the private legacy she had left behind, taking pieces of her story for purposes that remained hidden in shadow. As he prepared for bed, Thomas made a silent promise to the memory of the woman he had spent years protecting. He would find these missing pieces of her life, and he would bring them home. It was, he knew, the least he could do for someone who had given so much of herself to others that precious little had remained private. The investigation was just beginning, but already Thomas sensed that it would take him places he hadn't expected, reveal truths he might not want to know, and challenge everything he thought he understood about loyalty, memory, and the price of devotion. The late Queen's lost treasures were more than missing objects. They were clues to a mystery that would test his skills, his dedication, and, ultimately, his understanding of what it meant to serve someone even after they were gone. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new questions, and new challenges. But tonight, in the quiet of his London flat, Thomas Hartwell held on to one certainty. He would not let the Queen's memory be diminished by those who sought to possess it. Her treasures would be found, her legacy would be protected, and justice would be served. It was his duty, his honor, and his promise. The MI5 offices in Thames House felt different at 6 in the morning, when the building hummed with the quiet efficiency of night shift operations giving way to the bustle of a new day. Thomas Hartwell sat across from Agent Sarah Chun, a specialist in art theft and cultural crimes who had been assigned to assist with the investigation. Her reputation preceded her, sharp, methodical, and known for solving cases that others had written off as impossible. Chun spread a series of photographs across the conference table, each showing detailed images of the missing items that Thomas had cataloged from Mrs. Pembridge's descriptions. "I've been thinking about this all night," she said, her voice carrying the slight hoarseness that came from too much coffee and too little sleep. "These thefts aren't random, and they're not the work of a casual opportunist. Someone is building a very specific collection." Thomas leaned forward, studying the images. "What makes you so certain?" "The pattern. Look at what's been taken, a Faberge egg, but not the most valuable one in the collection. A photograph in a silver frame, but dozens of other photos were left untouched. Books from her personal library, but only specific titles. This isn't someone grabbing whatever looks expensive. This is someone who knows exactly what these items meant to her." Shin pulled up a file on her laptop and turned the screen toward Thomas. "I ran a background check on that business card you found. Dr. Sarah Mitchell doesn't exist, at least not as described. The Cambridge University affiliation is fake. The address is a mail forwarding service, and the phone number traces to a burner phone that's been inactive since shortly after Mrs. Pembridge's encounter. So we're dealing with a professional, or someone who's very well prepared. But here's what's interesting. The fake identity was created with remarkable attention to detail. The credentials looked authentic enough to fool someone who wasn't looking too closely. That suggests resources, planning, and probably experience with this type of deception." Thomas thought about Mrs. Pembridge's description of the woman who had come to the door. Young, well-spoken, confident enough to approach a royal estate with fake credentials. It painted a picture of someone who was comfortable with deception, but still relatively inexperienced at high-level criminal activity. "There's something else," Chin continued, pulling up another file. "I contacted the other royal estate managers this morning. Balmoral, Sandringham, Windsor, all of them have reported minor discrepancies in their inventories over the past 3 months. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger immediate investigation. But when you look at the pattern," she showed Thomas a spreadsheet that made his blood run cold. Across 5 different properties, dozens of small, personal items had gone missing. A fountain pen that the Queen had used for decades. A crystal paperweight that had belonged to her mother. A small clock that had sat on her desk at Balmoral for 30 years. Each theft was surgical in its precision, targeting items with sentimental rather than monetary value. "This is a coordinated operation," Thomas said, the full scope of the crime becoming clear. "Someone has been systematically looting the Queen's personal possessions from multiple properties. And they've been doing it slowly, carefully, in a way designed to avoid detection for as long as possible. If Mrs. Pembridge hadn't been so meticulous with her inventories, we might not have discovered this for months or even years." Chin closed her laptop and fixed Thomas with a serious stare. "There's something else you need to know. I ran these missing items through our database of stolen art and cultural artifacts. 3 of them, the Faberge egg, the silver-framed photograph, and the Queen Mother's paperweight, have already appeared in underground auction listings." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "They're being sold?" "Not exactly. The listings were posted on several dark web marketplaces, but they were withdrawn before any sales could be completed. Almost as if someone was testing the market, seeing what kind of interest and prices these items might generate. Or someone was using the listings to communicate with a specific buyer. A way of saying, 'Look what I have,' without actually conducting the transaction in public." Shin nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I was thinking. This feels like a commission job. Someone is collecting these items for a specific client who has very particular tastes and very deep pockets." The implications were staggering. If someone was paying for the theft of the Queen's personal possessions, it suggested a level of organization and resources that went far beyond a simple crime of opportunity. It also raised questions about who might have the motivation and means to acquire such items. "We need to expand this investigation," Thomas said. "If there's a specific client behind this, they're probably not British. The risk of being caught with stolen royal artifacts would be too high for someone operating in the UK. We're looking at an international operation." Shin gathered up the photographs and files. "I've already reached out to Interpol and our counterparts in several major art theft jurisdictions. If these items are being moved internationally, there might be other indicators we can track. But, Thomas, I need you to understand something. This investigation is going to take us into some very murky waters. What do you mean? The market for royal memorabilia is huge, and not all of it operates within legal boundaries. There are collectors around the world who would pay enormous sums for authentic personal items from the British royal family, especially from Queen Elizabeth. Some of these collectors don't ask questions about provenance, and some of them have connections to organized crime or other unsavory elements. Thomas thought about the implications. The thefts weren't just a violation of the Queen's memory. They were potentially funding criminal enterprises or providing leverage for individuals who might use the stolen items for purposes beyond simple collection. There's one more thing, Chun said as they prepared to leave the conference room. I want to bring in a consultant on this case. Professor James Whitfield from Oxford University. He's an expert on royal history and collectibles, and he's helped us before with cases involving stolen British cultural artifacts. Can he be trusted with this level of sensitive information? Absolutely. He's been cleared at the highest levels, and his knowledge of royal history is encyclopedic. If anyone can help us understand why these specific items were targeted, it's him. An hour later, Thomas found himself in the comfortable chaos of Professor Whitfield's office at Oxford. Books lined every available wall space, and papers covered most surfaces, but the elderly academic moved through the apparent disorder with practiced ease. At 78, Whitfield had devoted his entire career to studying the British monarchy, and his insights had proven invaluable to law enforcement agencies dealing with royal-related crimes. Fascinating, Whitfield murmured as he examined the list of missing items. His white hair was disheveled, and his thick glasses had slipped down his nose, but his eyes were sharp with intelligence. These aren't random selections at all. Someone has done their homework. What do you see that we're missing? Thomas asked. Look at the pattern of what's been taken. The Faberge egg wasn't just any piece. It was one that Prince Philip had given her early in their marriage, during a time when money was tight, and such gifts were particularly meaningful. The fountain pen was one she had used to sign some of her most important personal correspondence, including letters to her children during difficult periods in their lives. Whitfield stood and pulled a thick volume from one of his bookshelves, flipping through pages covered with photographs and detailed annotations. The crystal paperweight from the Queen Mother. That piece sat on the desk where she wrote her Christmas broadcasts for 15 years. Every year, she would hold it while reviewing her speech, a small ritual that helped her connect with the memory of her mother. Thomas felt a growing sense of unease. You're saying these items were chosen because of their emotional significance? More than that, they were chosen because they represent specific moments and relationships in the Queen's private life. Someone is collecting not just her possessions, but pieces of her personal history. The stories these objects could tell, the memories they represent, that's what makes them truly valuable to certain collectors. Chen leaned forward in her chair. Professor, in your experience, what kind of collector would be interested in acquiring items like these? Whitfield was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on his desk. There are several possibilities, none of them particularly pleasant. There are wealthy individuals who collect royal memorabilia as a form of social status, people who want to feel connected to power and history. But those collectors typically want items they can display, things that come with clear provenance and legal ownership. And the other possibilities? More troubling. There are people who collect these items for psychological reasons, individuals who develop obsessions with specific historical figures and want to possess pieces of their lives. There are also collectors who see royal artifacts as investments, hedges against economic uncertainty. And then, Whitfield paused, removing his glasses to clean them with obvious reluctance to continue. And then, there are collectors who acquire these items for purposes of leverage or blackmail. Personal possessions of royal family members can be incredibly sensitive, especially if they contain information or represent relationships that the family would prefer to keep private. Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Are you suggesting that someone might be planning to use these items against the royal family? I'm suggesting that we need to consider all possibilities. The Queen's personal possessions could contain information, hidden compartments, engraved messages, even just their provenance, that might be embarrassing or damaging if made public. In the wrong hands, they could be used as tools of coercion. Chen pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. I need to brief my superiors immediately. If there's even a possibility that this is about leverage rather than simple theft, we're looking at a potential national security issue. As Chen stepped outside to make her calls, Thomas remained with Professor Whitfield, who had returned to examining the list of missing items with his characteristic intensity. Professor, there's something else. The person who approached Mrs. Pembridge was a young woman using false credentials. Does that tell us anything about who might be behind this? Whitfield looked up from his papers, his expression thoughtful. It suggests someone who understands that a young, well-presented woman would be less threatening to household staff than a man. It also suggests someone with resources. Creating believable false credentials isn't cheap or easy. But, most importantly, it suggests someone who's willing to take significant risks. How so? Approaching a royal estate directly, even with false credentials, is an enormous gamble. The security systems, the background checks, the sheer audacity required. It speaks to either desperation or tremendous confidence. Given the sophisticated nature of the operation, I'd lean toward confidence. Thomas thought about Mrs. Pembridge's description of the woman. Confident, knowledgeable, professional, but also young, which suggested either exceptional skill for her age or guidance from someone more experienced. Could we be looking at a mentor-apprentice situation? Someone experienced directing a younger, more expendable operative? Very possible. The art theft world is full of such relationships. Experienced criminals who train younger accomplices to take the visible risks while they remain safely in the background. Chen returned from her phone calls with a grim expression. My superiors want a full briefing within the hour. The potential national security implications have everyone very concerned. Thomas, I need you to coordinate with Royal Protection Services immediately. If this is about leverage or blackmail, the entire royal family could be at risk. As they prepared to leave Oxford, Professor Whitfield handed Thomas a thick folder. This contains detailed information about each of the missing items, including their history and significance. If you're going to catch these thieves, you need to understand exactly what they've taken and why it matters. The drive back to London was tense, with Thomas and Chun both lost in thought about the expanding scope of their investigation. What had begun as a simple case of missing property had evolved into something much more complex and potentially dangerous. Thomas's phone rang as they entered the London city limits. It was Mrs. Pembridge, her voice tight with anxiety. Mr. Hartwell, I'm afraid there's been another incident. Someone broke into my sister's house last night. Nothing was taken, but they went through my personal belongings. They were looking for something specific. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Are you all right? Were you hurt? No, we were both out visiting neighbors when it happened. But, Mr. Hartwell, they found my spare keys to Raymill House. The keys are gone. The full implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. If the thieves had keys to the estate, they could return at any time, take whatever they wanted, and potentially use the property as a base of operations. Worse, if they were willing to target Mrs. Pembridge personally, it suggested they were becoming desperate or that their timeline had accelerated. Mrs. Pembridge, I want you to stay away from Raymill House and remain with your sister until further notice. We're dealing with people who are more dangerous than we initially realized. As Thomas ended the call, Chen was already on her phone arranging for emergency security upgrades at all royal properties. The investigation had taken a darker turn, and both of them realized they were racing against time to prevent something much worse than simple theft. The thieves were escalating their activities, which meant they were either under pressure from their clients or approaching some kind of deadline. Either way, Thomas knew they had to move quickly. The missing treasures were more than stolen property now. They were pieces of a puzzle that could threaten the security and privacy of the royal family itself. That evening, as emergency teams worked to secure Raymill House and other royal properties, Thomas sat in his flat reviewing Professor Whitfield's files. Each missing item had a story, a connection to moments of joy, sorrow, love, and loss in the Queen's long life. Someone was stealing those stories, collecting them for purposes that remained hidden but were clearly more sinister than simple avarice. The investigation was no longer just about recovering missing property. It had become a race to protect the memory and legacy of a woman who had devoted her life to service, and to prevent her most personal possessions from becoming tools in someone else's dangerous game. The underground parking garage beneath Tim's house felt like a different world at midnight, its concrete walls echoing with the distant hum of ventilation systems, and the occasional footstep of security personnel making their rounds. Thomas Hartwell sat in the passenger seat of Agent Chen's unmarked sedan, watching surveillance footage on a laptop screen that cast pale blue light across their faces. There, Chen said, pointing to a shadowy figure moving across the screen. Camera 12, Raymill House perimeter, 3:15 this morning. Thomas squinted at the grainy image. The figure was small, definitely female, moving with practiced stealth along the outer edge of the estate's gardens. She wore dark clothing and seemed to know exactly where the security cameras were positioned, staying just at the edges of their fields of view. She's been there before, Thomas observed. Look how confidently she moves. She knows the layout better than someone who's just studied the plans. That's what worries me, Chin replied, fast-forwarding through more footage. This isn't her first time on the property, which means our security has been compromised for longer than we thought. The past 48 hours had brought a flood of new information, none of it reassuring. The break-in at Mrs. Pembridge's sister's house had yielded forensic evidence, footprints, fibers, and, most importantly, a partial fingerprint on the window frame. The print had been run through every database available to British law enforcement, but had come back with no matches. Whoever they were dealing with had never been arrested or processed through any official system. International criminal, Chun had concluded, or someone with the resources to stay completely off the radar. The surveillance footage from Raymill House told a more complex story. The mysterious woman had been visiting the estate regularly for at least 2 months, always during the early morning hours when the skeleton crew of security personnel was at its smallest. She had clearly studied their patrol patterns, timing her visits to avoid detection. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message from Professor Whitfield. Found something important. Can you meet at my office immediately? Chun looked at the message over his shoulder. It's past midnight. What could be so urgent that it can't wait until morning? With Whitfield, it usually means he's discovered something that changes everything. He's not the type to call in the middle of the night unless it's critical. They drove through the empty streets of London toward Oxford, the city's familiar landmarks looking strange and ethereal in the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas found himself thinking about the Queen's final years, when she had increasingly sought refuge in private spaces like Raymill House. She had been one of the most photographed, most documented people in history, but in her quiet moments, surrounded by her personal treasures, she had been able to simply be herself. Now someone was systematically stealing those moments, collecting pieces of her private world for purposes that remained frustratingly unclear. Professor Whitfield's office was brightly lit when they arrived, and the elderly academic looked like he hadn't slept in days. Books were scattered across every surface, and several large maps had been pinned to the walls. He moved with nervous energy, his usually careful demeanor replaced by obvious excitement. I've been thinking about this all wrong, he said without preamble, gesturing for them to sit among the chaos of papers and books. We've been focusing on what's been taken, but we should be looking at what hasn't been taken. Thomas settled into a chair that was precariously balanced atop several thick volumes of royal history. What do you mean? Look at this, Whitfield said, spreading a detailed inventory across his desk. This is a complete list of the Queen's personal possessions at Raymill House, compiled over decades of visits. Now look at what's actually been stolen. He pulled out a red marker and began circling items on the list. The thefts represent less than 5% of the available items, and they follow a very specific pattern. But it's not just about emotional significance. There's something else connecting these pieces. Chin leaned forward, studying the marked items. What kind of connection? Dates, Whitfield said, his voice rising with excitement. Every single stolen item is connected to specific periods in the Queen's life. 1952 to 1954, 1968 to 1970, and 1997 to 1999. 3 very distinct time periods, each corresponding to major personal crises or transitions. Thomas felt a chill of understanding. The early years of her reign, when she was still learning to balance her role as queen with her desire for a normal family life. The period when her children were struggling with their own identities and relationships. And the years around Diana's death, when the monarchy faced its greatest modern crisis. Exactly, Whitfield confirmed. But here's what's truly remarkable. These are also the periods when the Queen was most isolated, when she was forced to make decisions that she later said were among the most difficult of her life. The stolen items aren't just memorabilia. They're artifacts from moments of profound personal struggle and growth. Chin was taking rapid notes. You're saying someone is collecting evidence of the Queen's most vulnerable moments? I'm saying someone is collecting the tools to tell a very specific story about her life. A story about the human cost of duty, the personal sacrifices required by her role. In the wrong hands, these items could be used to paint a picture of the monarchy that would be deeply damaging. The implications were staggering. Thomas thought about the current state of the royal family, still adjusting to life after the Queen's death, still navigating public opinion and political pressures. A carefully orchestrated revelation of the Queen's private struggles could undermine the institution she had spent 7 decades building and protecting. Professor, Thomas said carefully, are you suggesting this is about more than money or collecting? That someone is planning to use these items for political purposes? Whitfield removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes wearily. I'm suggesting that we're dealing with someone who understands exactly how powerful personal artifacts can be in shaping public perception. These items could be used to write an unauthorized biography, to create museum exhibits, to fuel documentaries or books that present the Queen's story in whatever light the possessor chooses. Chen's phone rang, and she stepped outside to take the call. Through the window, Thomas could see her pacing as she spoke, her expression growing increasingly grave. When she returned, her face was pale. That was my supervisor, she said. We've had a breakthrough, but it's not good news. The partial fingerprint from Mrs. Pembridge's sister's house has been matched through Interpol. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Who is she? Natasha Kozlova, age 28, Russian national. She's a known associate of several international art theft rings, and she has connections to some very dangerous people. But here's the concerning part. Her usual targets are much more valuable than anything she's taken from the royal estates. We're talking about someone who normally steals paintings worth millions, not sentimental trinkets worth thousands. Professor Whitfield looked up sharply, which means she's either being paid an extraordinary sum for these particular items, or she's working for someone with motivations beyond financial gain. There's more, Chen continued. Kozlova entered the UK on a tourist visa 3 months ago, using a passport that Interpol now believes was forged. She's been living under an assumed identity in a flat in South London, and when authorities went to check the address this evening, they found something very interesting. She pulled out her phone and showed them a series of photographs. The flat was sparse but organized, with one room that had been converted into a workspace. The walls were covered with photographs of royal properties, detailed floor plans, and what appeared to be a comprehensive timeline of the Queen's movements during her final years. This is the work of someone who's been planning this operation for a very long time, Thomas observed. Look at the level of detail in these plans. And look at this, Chen said, swiping to another photo. It showed a large map of the UK with several locations marked in red. These aren't just the properties where thefts have occurred. There are at least a dozen other locations marked, including some private residences that belong to close friends of the Queen. The scope of the operation was becoming clear, and it was far larger than any of them had initially realized. Someone had been conducting surveillance on the Queen's private life for months, possibly years, mapping her personal relationships and identifying locations where her most intimate possessions might be found. We need to warn everyone on this map, Thomas said. If Kozlova is working from a target list, there could be more thefts planned. Professor Whitfield had been studying the photographs with growing alarm. This level of surveillance suggests access to information that should have been highly classified. Someone provided Kozlova with intelligence about the Queen's personal routines, her relationships, her private properties. This operation couldn't have succeeded without inside help. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Thomas felt the weight of implications settling on his shoulders. If someone within the royal household or protection services had been feeding information to the thieves, it meant the security breach went far beyond missing objects. It suggested a level of betrayal that could shake the foundations of everything he had dedicated his career to protecting. Chen was already on her phone again, coordinating with multiple agencies to secure the locations marked on Kozlova's map. We're treating this as a potential national security threat, she explained as she ended her calls. If there's a mole within the royal household, we need to identify them before they can do any more damage. What about Kozlova herself? Thomas asked. Any leads on her current location? She's gone. The flat was abandoned, probably within hours of our discovering the missing keys at Mrs. Pembridge's sister's house. She knew we were getting close and decided to cut her losses. But, Thomas, there's something else we need to discuss. Chen's expression was grave as she pulled up another file on her phone. While Kozlova is clearly the hands-on operative, the intelligence she was working from suggests coordination at a much higher level. The kind of detailed surveillance data she had access to would require significant resources and connections within the security establishment. Thomas felt a cold dread settling in his chest. You're saying we're looking for someone with access to classified information about royal security protocols. I'm saying we're looking for someone who's been systematically gathering intelligence about the Queen's private life for an extended period, someone with the authority and access to obtain information that should have been strictly compartmentalized. Professor Whitfield had been quietly studying the photographs while they talked, and now he looked up with an expression of deep concern. there's something else we need to consider. The timing of this operation, coming so soon after the Queen's death, suggests it was planned to take advantage of the transition period when security protocols might be less rigorous. Or, Thomas said grimly, it suggests that someone knew exactly when these opportunities would arise because they had advanced knowledge of security changes and personnel shifts. The investigation was taking them into increasingly dangerous territory. What had begun as a case of missing memorabilia had evolved into a potential conspiracy involving international criminals, possible espionage, and betrayal at the highest levels of the royal security establishment. As they prepared to return to London, Professor Whitfield handed Thomas a new folder. This contains everything I've been able to piece together about the historical significance of the stolen items. If someone is planning to use these artifacts to construct a narrative about the Queen's life, you'll need to understand exactly what story they're trying to tell. The drive back to the city was tense, with all three of them lost in thought about the expanding implications of their discoveries. Thomas found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the people he worked with, the systems he had trusted, and the institutions he had devoted his life to protecting. As dawn began to break over London, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Thomas realized that they were no longer just investigating a crime. They were racing to prevent a potential disaster that could undermine the monarchy itself. Somewhere in the shadows, people with access to the most sensitive information about the royal family were working to exploit the Queen's memory for purposes that remained hidden, but were clearly hostile to everything she had represented. The missing treasures were more than stolen property now. They were weapons in a war that was being fought in shadows, using the Queen's own private moments as ammunition against the institution she had spent her life building and defending. And Thomas was beginning to understand that catching Natasha Kozlova was only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous investigation. The secure briefing room in the basement of Buckingham Palace felt smaller than usual as Thomas Hartwell faced a panel of senior officials whose combined experience in royal protection spanned nearly a century. Director General Sir Marcus Pemberton sat at the head of the table, his weathered face betraying none of the tension that filled the room. Around him sat representatives from MI5, MI6, Scotland Yard, and the palace security detail, all united by the growing realization that they were dealing with a threat unlike anything they had encountered before. Agent Sarah Chun stood at the front of the room, presenting the evidence they had gathered over the past week. Behind her, a large screen displayed photographs, timelines, and connection maps that painted a picture of an operation far more sophisticated than anyone had initially imagined. Ladies and gentlemen, Chen began, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was about to reveal. We are not dealing with simple theft. We are facing a coordinated intelligence operation designed to gather compromising material about the late Queen's private life, with the apparent intention of using that material to damage the reputation of the monarchy. Thomas watched the faces around the table as Chun laid out their findings. The discovery of Natasha Kozlova's identity had been just the beginning. In the days that followed, their investigation had uncovered a network of contacts that stretched across Europe and into Russia, with financial backing that suggested state-level resources. The stolen items, Chen continued, were specifically chosen for their potential to support a particular narrative about Queen Elizabeth's reign, one that emphasizes personal struggles, difficult decisions, and the human cost of her royal duties. In isolation, each item might seem harmless. Together, they could be used to construct a story that portrays the monarchy as a burden that caused immense personal suffering. Sir Marcus leaned forward. Are you suggesting this is part of a broader disinformation campaign? We believe so, sir. The sophistication of the operation, the specific targeting of emotionally significant items, and the international connections all point to an effort to gather material that could be used to undermine public confidence in the royal family at a time when the institution is already facing challenges in the post-Elizabeth era. Thomas felt the weight of the implications settling over the room. The Queen's death had marked the end of an era, and her successor faced the enormous challenge of maintaining the monarchy's relevance and public support in a rapidly changing world. A carefully orchestrated revelation of the Queen's private struggles could be devastating to that effort. Mr. Hartwell, Sir Marcus said, turning his attention to Thomas, you've been closer to this investigation than anyone else. What's your assessment of the internal security implications? Thomas stood, his mind racing through everything they had discovered. Sir, the level of detailed intelligence that Kozlova had access to suggests that someone within our own organization has been providing information to hostile actors. The surveillance data she possessed could only have come from sources with direct access to royal protection protocols and classified information about the Queen's personal routines. The silence that followed was profound. Everyone in the room understood the implications of what Thomas had just said. The Royal Protection Service was built on trust, loyalty, and absolute discretion. The possibility that someone within their ranks had betrayed that trust struck at the heart of everything they represented. "We've begun a comprehensive security review," continued Thomas. "Every person with access to the relevant information is being investigated. But, sir, I have to say that the breadth of intelligence Kozlova possessed suggests this breach may have been ongoing for years." Agent Patricia Morse from MI6 spoke for the first time. "Mr. Hartwell, have you identified any patterns that might help us narrow down the potential sources of this intelligence breach?" Thomas pulled out his notes, though he had memorized the details long ago. The information Kozlova had access to falls into several categories. First, detailed floor plans of private royal residences, including security arrangements and staff schedules. Second, personal information about the Queen's habits, preferences, and the emotional significance of specific possessions. Third, intelligence about planned security changes and personnel rotations that would have given her advanced knowledge of when properties would be most vulnerable. That's a combination that suggests either multiple sources or someone with extraordinarily broad access, observed Commander James Fletcher from Scotland Yard. "Which brings us to our most serious concern," Chen interjected. "We've identified at least 3 other similar operations that have been conducted against European royal families and high-profile political figures over the past 5 years. The methodology is consistent, the financial backing appears to come from the same sources, and, in each case, the gathered intelligence has been used to support disinformation campaigns that have significantly damaged public confidence in the targeted institutions." Sir Marcus's expression grew even more grave. "Are you telling us that this is part of a systematic effort to undermine European institutions?" "That's exactly what we're telling you, sir. The Queen's death provided an opportunity for hostile actors to gather material that could be used to attack the monarchy during a period of transition and vulnerability. But the operation didn't begin with her death. Our evidence suggests it has been ongoing for at least 3 years. Thomas felt a cold anger building in his chest as he thought about the implications. Someone had been watching the Queen during her final years, cataloging her private moments and personal struggles, waiting for the opportunity to exploit them. It was a violation that went beyond theft or even espionage. It was an attack on the memory of someone who had devoted her entire life to public service. "What about Natasha Kozlova?" asked Agent Morse. "Any progress in tracking her current location?" Chen shook her head grimly. "She's vanished completely. We believe she left the UK within hours of abandoning her flat in South London. Passport control has no record of her departure, which suggests she either used forged documents or left through unofficial channels. However, we have identified several of her known associates who are still operating in the UK." She clicked to the next slide, which showed photographs of 3 individuals. These are Kozlova's known contacts in London. Vladimir Petrov, who operates several legitimate businesses that we believe serve as fronts for money laundering and intelligence gathering. Maria Santos, a Portuguese national who works as a researcher for various academic institutions and has been asking questions about royal history at several universities. And Dr. James Whitman, an art dealer who specializes in historical artifacts and has connections to several questionable collectors. Thomas studied the faces on the screen. "Have any of these individuals been under surveillance?" "We've just begun," Chen replied. "But we've already discovered some concerning connections. Petrov's businesses have received significant funding from sources with ties to Russian intelligence services. Santos has been making inquiries about the Queen's personal correspondence and private papers. And Whitman has been in contact with several international collectors who have expressed interest in acquiring royal memorabilia through questionable means." Sir Marcus stood and walked to the window that looked out onto the palace gardens. Even through the reinforced glass and from this depth below ground, the weight of the institution they were protecting was palpable. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are facing a threat that goes to the very heart of what we're sworn to protect. This isn't just about recovering stolen property. This is about defending the integrity of the crown itself." He turned back to face the room. "I want a coordinated response involving all agencies represented here. We need to identify and neutralize the intelligence source within our own ranks. We need to track down Kozlova and her associates. And We need to recover the stolen items before they can be used to damage the monarchy's reputation. Thomas raised his hand. Sir, there's something else we need to consider. The items that have been stolen aren't just random selections. They tell a very specific story about the Queen's private struggles. If hostile actors are planning to use them for disinformation purposes, we need to be prepared to counter whatever narrative they're trying to construct. What kind of counter-narrative? Asked Commander Fletcher. Thomas thought about the conversations he'd had with Professor Whitfield, about the deep understanding of royal history that the thieves had demonstrated. We need to be ready to tell the full story of what these items represent, not just the selective interpretation that could be used against us. Every one of these possessions has a context, a fuller meaning that demonstrates the Queen's strength and dedication rather than any weakness or suffering. Chen nodded approvingly. Thomas is right. If we can anticipate how these items might be misrepresented, we can prepare an accurate counter-narrative that honors the Queen's memory while neutralizing any attempt to distort her legacy. Agent Morse leaned forward. That raises another question. How do we know these items will be used for public disinformation? Isn't it possible they're simply being collected for private purposes? Because of what happened next, Chen replied, clicking to another slide. Yesterday, we intercepted communications indicating that preparations are being made to publish a book about the Queen's private life, using previously unknown personal artifacts as evidence for claims about her mental state and private struggles. The room fell silent as the full implications became clear. Thomas felt his hands clench into fists as he imagined the Queen's personal possessions being used to construct false narratives about her character and reign. Do we know who's behind the book project? Asked Sir Marcus. We're still investigating, but the communications suggest involvement by a publishing house with ties to the same financial network that funded Kozlova's operation. This isn't just theft, it's the foundation for a coordinated attack on the Queen's legacy. Thomas stood again, his voice tight with controlled anger. Sir, we need to move quickly. Every day these items remain in hostile hands increases the risk that they'll be used to cause permanent damage to the monarchy's reputation. We can't just investigate this threat, we need to eliminate it. Sir Marcus nodded grimly. Agreed. Mr. Hartwell, I want you to coordinate with Agent Chun and develop an operational plan to recover these items and neutralize this threat. You have full authority to pursue any leads and coordinate with any agencies necessary. As the meeting broke up, Thomas found himself standing alone with Chun in the corridor outside the briefing room. The weight of their responsibility felt enormous, but he also felt a sense of clarity about what needed to be done. Thomas, Chun said quietly, there's something else I didn't mention in the briefing. We've received intelligence that Kozlova may be planning to return to the UK. If she does, it's probably to retrieve something she left behind or to complete one final theft before the network is shut down. Thomas felt a surge of determination. Then, we'll be ready for her. This ends now, Sarah. Whatever it takes, we're going to recover those items and protect the Queen's memory from these people. As they walked through the palace corridors toward their next briefing, Thomas thought about the Queen's final years, when she had found peace in her private spaces surrounded by the possessions that connected her to a lifetime of memories. Someone had violated that peace, stolen those connections, and planned to use them as weapons against everything she had stood for. But they wouldn't succeed. Thomas had made a promise to protect the Queen's memory, and he intended to keep it, no matter how dangerous the path ahead might prove to be. The investigation was entering its most critical phase, and the true test of their dedication was about to begin. The warehouse in East London sat dark and silent at 3 in the morning, its industrial surroundings providing perfect cover for the operation that was about to unfold. Thomas Hartwell crouched behind a shipping container, his earpiece crackling with quiet communications from the dozen agents positioned around the building. After weeks of investigation, surveillance, and careful planning, they had finally tracked down the location where the stolen royal treasures were being held. Agent Sarah Chen's voice came through his earpiece, calm and professional despite the tension. All units in position. Target building confirmed occupied. We have visual on 2 individuals inside, consistent with intelligence reports. Thomas checked his watch and felt his pulse quicken. Intelligence gathered over the past 72 hours had confirmed that Natasha Kozlova had indeed returned to the UK, not to steal more items, but to oversee the final stage of the operation. The stolen treasures were being prepared for transport to an unknown international destination, where they would disappear forever into the hands of collectors who cared nothing for their historical significance or the violation they represented. Remember, Thomas spoke quietly into his microphone. Our primary objective is to recover the stolen items intact. These aren't just evidence. They're irreplaceable pieces of British history. The breakthrough had come when Professor Whitfield discovered that one of the stolen items, the Queen Mother's crystal paperweight, had a nearly invisible engraving that was mentioned in insurance records but not widely known. When Chen's team monitored communications between known art dealers, they intercepted a conversation in which someone was asking about the significance of that specific engraving. The query had been traced to Vladimir Petrov, one of Kozlova's associates, and from there it had been a matter of careful surveillance to locate their base of operations. Movement inside, reported Agent Thompson from his position at the rear of the building. Someone's packing items into protective cases. Thomas felt a surge of both anticipation and anxiety. After everything they had discovered about the scope and sophistication of this operation, he knew they were dealing with professionals who wouldn't surrender easily. But more importantly, he knew that the items being packed might represent their only chance to recover the stolen pieces of the Queen's legacy. Chen's voice crackled through the earpiece again. Intelligence confirms the target is preparing to move the items within the hour. We need to move now before they can transport them to the airport. Thomas signaled to the agents flanking him and began moving toward the warehouse entrance. The building was old but well-maintained, its loading dock providing easy access for vehicles. Through grimy windows, he could see lights moving inside, confirming that the occupants were indeed preparing for departure. The entry was swift and coordinated. Thomas and his team breached the front entrance while Chen's unit secured the rear, cutting off any escape routes. Inside, the warehouse was divided into sections by tall shelving units, creating a maze of narrow corridors that could provide cover for anyone trying to evade capture. Armed police. Stand down, Thomas shouted, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. The response was immediate and violent. Gunfire erupted from somewhere deeper in the warehouse, bullets ricocheting off metal shelving and concrete walls. Thomas dove for cover behind a stack of wooden crates, his mind racing as he tried to assess the situation. 2 shooters, at least, Chen reported from her position near the rear entrance. They're positioned to defend the main work area in the center of the building. Thomas peered around the edge of his cover and caught a glimpse of the warehouse's central area. Tables had been set up under bright lights, and he could see protective cases and packaging materials scattered across the surfaces. More importantly, he could see several small objects that looked like they might be the stolen royal treasures. I have visual on the items, he reported. Center of the building, approximately 30 meters from the front entrance. The gunfire intensified, and Thomas realized they were dealing with people who were prepared to fight rather than face arrest. These weren't simple thieves. They were professionals with training and resources, willing to use deadly force to protect their operation. Suspects are moving, reported Agent Morrison from a position along the east wall. Looks like they're trying to reach the items and destroy them rather than let them be recovered. Thomas felt cold fear grip his stomach. If Kozlova and her associates destroyed the stolen treasures rather than allow them to be recovered, it would represent not just the loss of irreplaceable historical artifacts, but the destruction of the evidence needed to fully understand and counteract the broader conspiracy they represented. All units, priority is protecting those items, Thomas commanded. We cannot allow them to be damaged or destroyed. He began moving forward, using the shelving units for cover as he worked his way toward the central area. Behind him, he could hear other members of his team following, their movements coordinated and professional despite the dangerous circumstances. As he got closer to the work area, Thomas could see more details of what the thieves had been doing. The stolen items were laid out on tables like museum pieces, each one photographed and documented. Professional lighting had been set up to capture high-quality images, and Thomas realized they were creating a comprehensive visual record of each treasure. On one table, he could see the Queen's missing Faberge egg, its surface gleaming under the bright lights. Next to it was the silver-framed photograph that Mrs. Pembridge had described, showing a young Elizabeth and Philip in an intimate moment from their early marriage. The sight of these personal treasures, removed from their proper context and treated like commodity items, filled Thomas with a renewed sense of anger and determination. A figure moved across his field of view, and Thomas caught his first clear look at Natasha Kozlova. She was exactly as Mrs. Pembridge had described, young, professional, and moving with confident precision even under these dangerous circumstances. She was carrying a small case and appeared to be trying to secure the most valuable items before escaping. Target identified, Thomas reported into his microphone. Kozlova is attempting to secure items for transport. The gunfire was coming from her associate, a large man with military bearing who had positioned himself to provide cover while she worked. Thomas could see that he was experienced with weapons and tactics, suggesting professional training that went beyond simple criminal activity. Chen's voice came through the earpiece with urgent news. Thomas, we've got vehicles approaching the building. Multiple units, moving fast. This might be an extraction attempt. The situation was escalating rapidly. If Kozlova's associates were arriving to help her escape, the warehouse could quickly become a battlefield. Worse, if they were willing to use heavier weapons or explosives, the stolen treasures could be destroyed in the crossfire. Thomas made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Instead of waiting for backup or trying to coordinate a more cautious approach, he broke from cover and sprinted directly toward the central work area where the stolen items were displayed. The move caught Kozlova by surprise, but her associate reacted quickly, swinging his weapon toward Thomas and firing rapidly. Thomas felt a bullet graze his shoulder as he dove behind one of the tables, sending several precious items scattered across the concrete floor. "I'm hit, but still operational," he reported, ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder as he assessed the damage to the artifacts around him. To his relief, most of the items appeared to be undamaged. The Queen Mother's crystal paperweight had rolled under a nearby table, but seemed intact. The Fabergé had remained in its protective case, and the framed photograph was still secure despite the chaos. Kozlova was shouting something in Russian to her associate, and Thomas could hear the sound of vehicles pulling up outside the warehouse. The extraction was beginning, and he realized they had only minutes before the entire operation would be compromised. "All units, we need to end this now," Chen commanded over the radio. "External targets are moving to support the suspects inside." Thomas reached for the nearest stolen item, a small leather journal that had belonged to the Queen, and was startled when Kozlova's voice cut through the chaos. "Stop," she called out in accented English. "You don't understand what you're interfering with." Thomas kept his weapon trained on her position while protecting the scattered treasures around him. "Then, explain it to me. Why are you stealing from a dead woman? What could possibly justify this?" For a moment, the gunfire ceased, and Kozlova stepped into view with her hands partially raised. Up close, Thomas could see that she was younger than he had expected, probably not much older than 25, with intelligent eyes that held no trace of the criminal desperation he had expected to find. "She wasn't just a queen," Kozlova said, her voice carrying surprising emotion. "She was a human being who suffered for her position, who gave up everything for duty. The world deserves to know the truth about what that cost her." Thomas felt a moment of confusion. "The truth? You're stealing her private possessions to reveal some kind of truth." "I'm preserving evidence of her humanity," Kozlova replied. "Evidence that would otherwise disappear into royal archives where no one would ever see it. These items tell the story of a woman who paid a terrible personal price for her public role." The sound of gunfire resumed as Kozlova's associate engaged with agents entering from the rear of the building. But Thomas found himself momentarily transfixed by her words and the genuine conviction in her voice. "Even if that's true," he said, "these items belong to the British people, not to whoever hired you to steal them. If there's a story to be told, it should be told honestly, not through theft and deception." Kozlova's expression hardened. "The British people would never be allowed to see these items if we left them where they were. The royal family controls their own narrative, controls what history is preserved and what is hidden. Someone needed to ensure these pieces of truth survived." Thomas realized that he wasn't dealing with a simple criminal motivated by greed. Kozlova genuinely believed she was performing a service, preserving historical truth that would otherwise be suppressed. It was a form of ideology that made her more dangerous, not less, because she was willing to take significant risks for her cause. "Who's paying you to do this?" Thomas asked, trying to keep her talking while his colleagues worked to secure the building. "People who care about historical truth more than they care about protecting powerful institutions," she replied. "People who believe the world has a right to understand what monarchy really costs the people who serve it." The conversation was interrupted by an explosion that shook the entire building. Someone outside had used explosives to breach the loading dock, and Thomas could hear the sound of multiple vehicles and numerous personnel entering the warehouse. "All units, we're being overrun," Chen reported urgently. "Multiple armed individuals entering from the west side. We need immediate backup." Thomas realized they were facing a coordinated extraction operation with resources far beyond what he had expected. Kozlova's associates had come prepared for a serious firefight, which suggested the value of the operation went far beyond the stolen royal treasures. But, as the chaos intensified around him, Thomas made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Instead of focusing on capturing Kozlova or engaging with her armed associates, he concentrated entirely on protecting the scattered royal treasures. He began gathering them carefully, placing each item in protective cases while gunfire and explosions continued around him. The Queen's personal journal, her father's watch, the Fabergé egg that had sat on her writing desk for decades. Each piece represented a connection to a life devoted to service, and Thomas refused to let them be destroyed or lost in the violence. "Thomas, we need to evacuate," Chen called out as the sound of approaching sirens indicated that backup was finally arriving. "This whole area is becoming unstable." But Thomas continued working, methodically securing each treasure while the warehouse became a battlefield around him. He could see Kozlova and several associates moving toward a breach in the far wall, apparently preparing to escape despite the chaos. In the end, it came down to a choice between pursuing the thieves and protecting the stolen treasures. Thomas chose the treasures, spending the final moments of the operation ensuring that every recovered item was properly secured rather than trying to prevent Kozlova's escape. As police reinforcements swarmed the warehouse and the immediate danger passed, Thomas found himself sitting on the concrete floor surrounded by cases containing the Queen's personal possessions. His shoulder throbbed with pain, and his hands shook with residual adrenaline. But the items were safe. Chen approached him as paramedics began treating his wound. "Kozlova got away," she reported grimly, along with most of her associates. "But, Thomas, you saved them. Every single stolen item has been recovered intact." Thomas looked down at the cases containing pieces of the Queen's private life. Each item had a story, a connection to moments of joy, sorrow, love, and loss in her remarkable life. They had been stolen, photographed, and prepared for exploitation, but they were home now. "What happens next?" he asked as medics helped him to his feet. "Now we make sure these items are returned to where they belong," Chen replied. "And we continue investigating the network behind this operation. Kozlova may have escaped, but we've disrupted their plans and recovered evidence that will help us prevent similar operations in the future." As Thomas was led out of the warehouse, he took one last look around the space where the Queen's treasures had been held captive. The thieves had been motivated by ideology rather than simple greed, believing they were preserving historical truth. But they had failed to understand that the real truth about Queen Elizabeth II wasn't hidden in her private struggles. It was visible in her lifetime of public service, her unwavering dedication to duty, and the love that the British people felt for her memory. The treasures were going home, back to their proper place in the preservation of royal history. And Thomas Hartwell, despite his injured shoulder and emotional exhaustion, felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that he had kept his promise to protect the Queen's memory, even after her death. The investigation would continue, the network behind the thefts would be pursued, and justice would eventually be served. But tonight, in a warehouse in East London, the most important victory had already been won. The Queen's private treasures had been recovered, her memory had been protected, and the institution she had served so faithfully remained secure from those who sought to exploit her legacy. As the ambulance carried him toward the hospital, Thomas closed his eyes and allowed himself to feel, for the first time in weeks, that his duty had been fulfilled.